Hello, I'm Dick Morningstar, the founding chairman of the Global Energy Center at the Atlantic Council. And I want to say good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you, wherever you are in the world. And I'm thanking you for joining our discussion today with the Energy Futures Initiative, who are co-hosting this discussion and launching their new report, The Future of Natural Gas in a Deeply Decarbonized World. This is an incredibly important and comprehensive report, which is the result of 8 workshops in various regions of the world and discusses various approaches throughout the world with respect to strategies in connection with natural gas and decarbonization. I had the opportunity to go through it this weekend. It's just incredibly comprehensive. I also have the pleasure this morning of introducing former Secretary of Energy Ernie Moniz, who's the CEO of the Energy Futures Initiative, a great friend of the Atlantic Council, among other things, my baseball coach. And we look forward to this discussion today and to continuing to work together with the Energy Futures Initiative. So it's a pleasure for me to, without any further comments, to turn the event over to Secretary Moniz and for his opening remarks. So over to you, Arnie.
Well, thanks, Dick, and thanks for partnering with EFI, both on the study and, of course, in this discussion of our report. On the other hand, as your baseball coach, I do have to say we really should be in Atlanta, where the Red Sox need a couple of fresh arms that can throw 35-mile-per-hour fastballs. But anyway,
an unbelievably difficult weekend, and I'm glad that we're able to this morning get our act together and do our thing.
Right. But anyway, let's talk natural gas. And I just want to make a few opening comments before Melanie provides more insight into the report itself. If I could have the first slide.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Ernie. Can somebody give me permission to, I can't share the screen. I've tried.
Oh,
you have permission now to share the screen.
Okay, thank you.
Well,
thank you.
I'll proceed with or without permission.
All
okay.
Right. Hold on.
Thank you. Yeah. So, I think it's fairly evident, but just to make it explicit, we see the role of natural gas as being quite important as we head to a low carbon world. On the right-hand side, the figure shows how, starting from the bottom, basically biomass, then coal, then oil, then natural gas have come in over the last century and a half, roughly speaking, with gas now quite comparable to oil and coal, but in particular with gas going up and coal going somewhat down, certainly in the United States, over this time period. Natural gas in its increase, certainly in the United States, has been a big part of the decarbonization by displacing coal. It's also a critical fuel and feedstock for industrial activities. And so we think it's going to have a significant role. And yet there is an obvious tension as we get more and more ambitious, and we'll see what happens in Glasgow. But as we get more and more ambitious in terms of decarbonizing, it's clear that the carbon benefits of natural gas, even in a country like the United States, with a substantial amount of coal left, which could be displaced, the reality is natural gas is a significant contributor overall to carbon emissions, and that will have to change, at least in terms of unabated natural gas combustion over time. So that tension, we see it in the United States, and of course, we do or will be seeing it globally. However, our thesis was, and it's not too surprising, that we believe that kind of monolithic views of this competition between what natural gas can do for climate, for security, and for economic development uh, will also be in tension in other parts of the world, but that tension must be viewed differently in different regions of the world. And that's why we chose to take this approach of 8 workshops, each focusing on different major areas of the world to understand the texture of this tension as a foundation for further work that we want to do in terms of going ahead, advancing analysis, and being able to make recommendations for how this future for natural gas will fit into a decarbonizing world. So that's fundamentally what we have done. We've done it with major partnerships. If I could have the next slide, please. The We just note here that on the left, we had a number of partners around the world who were part of the planning and execution of each of these regional workshops. I note the Atlantic Council, our host today, was also part of the study partnership, and representatives of many of these think tanks will be in the program today. And secondly, on the right, we should also, of course, note that the sponsors included the Gas Technology Institute, the Hewlett Foundation, and Sempra. With that, I'll come back and offer a few final remarks after we've gone through the program. But in the meantime, let me turn it back to you, Dick, to advance the program.
Thanks very much, Mr. Secretary, for your opening comments. And I just want to emphasize very briefly how important this is, because the issue is not gas or no gas. Gas is going to be around for a long time. And the way it's going to be around for a long time is just what you're saying. Strategies all around the world to decarbonize gas, to make it more acceptable from an environmental standpoint. And so important. And with that, I turn it over to Melanie Kenderdine, Senior Fellow here at the Global Energy Center, another great friend of the Atlantic Council, a principal of the Energy Futures Initiative, former counselor to the Secretary at the Department of Energy, and a whole bunch of other things that you can read her biography. But it's a great pleasure for me to introduce Melanie for her comments.
Great, and thank you so much, Dick. Am I unmuted? I'm unmuted. Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, thank you, Dick, and thanks to the Atlantic Council. I'd like to also thank Randy Bell, the panelists, the moderators, and the partners and sponsors. I'd like to put a shout out to the EFI staff as well. They've been working incredibly hard on this, particularly Nicole Pavia, and would like to thank them for an amazing effort. I only have 20 minutes to cover the world, so I'm going to talk really fast. You saw Ernie's slide with a figure on it. Gas was virtually zero in 1950, and it's now the world's third largest source of energy. I was a little surprised by that, and I've been working on natural gas for a long time. I just didn't realize basically what its short lifespan has been. Going to start with some high level data, issues, trends that could affect natural gas supply and demand in a deeply decarbonized world. Ernie gave you the motivation for the study already, and let me say a little bit more about the structure. Ernie also mentioned we held 8 regional workshops over a 6-month period. We had over 200 experts from research organizations, industry think tanks, and the investment community, innovators, et cetera, et cetera. We looked at global and regional trends that will shape the role of natural gas in a deeply decarbonized world. We started with Central and South America. That's 42 countries total. That includes the Caribbean island nations. We then went to sub-Saharan Africa, thanks to Alan. He's on the phone call here. He helped us organize that. 47 countries in that region. South Asia, 8 countries. Southeast Asia, 10 countries. Northeast Asia, 3 countries. And then we had Europe, that's EU plus 12. And MENA, which I've left off my notes. I think that was 12, 13 countries. And then finally North America, which is 3 countries. And then we have our rollout today. I just corrected that. It said June 14th, 2020. It's great when you can control the slides because I could fix that when I looked at it. This is natural gas in the context of energy, total energy supply by region. And what you see here over the past 2 decades, global gas consumption has increased by 21%. That's compared to increases of 10% for oil and 3% for coal. And as Ernie mentioned, consumption has risen steadily, but there are many, many regional differences. They show up here on this slide. On this slide, that light brown there is the gas. So in the Middle East, North America, and Europe, it's a high volume compared to other regions of the world. It's also high as a total percentage. I'll say a little bit about that in a second. Northeast Asia, pretty significant volume, but not huge as a percentage of their total supply. That black part of the bar is coal. And another place I look at, Southeast Asia, and quite frankly, Central and South America, small volumes, but growing in significant percentages of those regions' energy supply. Then you look here, Middle East and North Africa, it's approaching 60% of their total energy supply. Here in North America, US, it's about 40%, or North America, it's approaching 40%. So a lot of gas volumes, key regions of the world, very different, as Ernie said. This is a little bit on US LNG export destinations. Okay, this is in 2019. The blue is liquefaction, green is regas. You can see North America, 11 liquefaction, 19 regas. Europe, the opposite, 4 liquefaction, 33 regas. Same in South America, only 1 liquefaction. Africa, it's all liquefaction. Clearly for export, Middle East is both split. Australia has 8, again, clearly for export. And then Asia, 70 regas and 5 liquefaction facilities. So here's your summary of those. 46% of liquefaction facilities are in 2 regions of the world, North America and Africa. Numbers on regas, 52% are in Asia and 24% in Europe. So you've got 76% regasifications in facilities in 2 regions. This is a little on CO2 emissions from natural gas and fossil fuels. Natural gas here, this is just fossil fuels. It's 22% of emissions from fossil fuels. Then I know there's a lot of discussion about methane. And this is IEA numbers from, this is global methane emissions. The middle green bar there, that's energy. Natural gas is 45 metric tons of methane compared to 39 for coal, 39 for oil. But when you look here, all anthropogenic methane emissions, gas is 12.4%. That compares to 40% for agriculture. So one of the groups we discussed that we need a lot of innovation in methane emission reduction and other anthropogenic sources as well, not just natural gas. These are CO2 emission savings from, this is switching a little bit to some trends. These are IEA numbers as well. And just looking there at China, 1 year emissions reductions from fuel switching from coal to gas was approximately 8% of their total emissions reduced from their fuel switching from coal to gas. Those numbers in the US are pretty significant as well. Another trend we discussed in the study is urbanization. This is 2016 to 2030. We add 10 cities of 10 million or more. 4 of those will be in Africa, 18 cities of 5 to 10 million, so forth and so on. Significant urbanization, and lots of concerns about air quality as we urbanize. Natural gas, when you look at these are criteria pollutants, percent of global total 2019. So SOx, it's 0.7% for natural gas, 58% for coal. NOx, 10% natural gas, 72% for oil. And then PM 2.5, 4% for gas, 63% for bioenergy. So discussions in the workshops, a lot of value for natural gas for air quality reasons. And so you could see fuel switching for that reason. This is comparing energy consumption by OECD and non-OECD countries. OECD, this is 2010 to 2050 projections. In OECD countries, energy consumption goes up 20 quads. In non-OECD countries, it goes up 200 quads. So 10 times the level of increase in non-OECD countries than OECD. There you see, and this is specific for the sectors, 70 quads in industry. It is 50 quads in transportation, and another 20 quads in buildings. So that's a significant portion. I didn't look at the commercial buildings, but a huge percentage increase and total volume increases by sector, leading with industry. That says something about gas demand, because you need natural gas for industrial uses. There aren't any technology options. And then this is same looking at electricity out to 2050, OECD, non-OECD, and you can see 5 trillion kilowatt hour increase in OECD, 20 trillion kilowatt in non-OECD. Another trend that we looked at is the move towards net zero emissions by countries of the world. This is from earlier this year that I looked up these numbers. It was surprising to me. A year and a half ago, it was 16 countries that were considering or had targets for net zero. Now, these are the red countries have achieved net zero. There are 2 countries, 6 where it's in law, 6 where there's proposed legislation, 16 in policy documents, and 100 where the policy is under discussion, including the US and the Biden administration. So 130 countries have either implemented or considering net zero targets. 24% of those are island nations. Island nations are clearly very nervous about climate change and sea level rise. This is total investment needed. These are IRENA numbers by 2030 to achieve rural renewable energy targets in NDCs. And there are unconditional targets, and then there are conditional targets, okay? And those conditional targets are largely in developing countries. You can see how they break out over regions. And then here we get to Asia is huge, obviously, and conditional. This is $1.7 trillion of investment just for countries to meet renewable targets in their NDCs. That is different than overall targets, where IRENA says that to meet Paris commitments, not just NDC, not specific to renewables, although there are some what I just showed you are specific, but renewable installed capacity on the grid would have to cover double from $310 billion a year to $620 billion a year. So that's the kind of increase the point of that is that natural gas will be competing for investment dollars with countries that either have firm commitments or targets of renewable technologies in their NDCs. I'm going to switch to the workshops. These were cross-cutting issues that we had in we found in all of the workshops. All of the region expressed strong commitments to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. There may be a continued role for natural gas in a decarbonized global economy. Again, significant regional differences. Workshop participants stated that global emissions reductions may fall short of what would be necessary. That came out of all of the regions. Participants found that impacts of COVID on decarbonization are varying widely across regions. Innovations in clean energy technologies are needed. Cost of natural gas relative to alternative sources factors heavily into regional gas use. Natural gas is very expensive in key regions of the world, not in the US, but in regions here. Then innovative business models and project finance mechanisms are needed. Infrastructure, um, investments and financial institutions are shifting towards low carbon. Everyone is aware of that. I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. Another key concern in particularly North Asia and Northeast Asia and in Eastern Europe is the need for resilient, reliable, secure energy systems was discussed. And then North America's domestic natural gas supply presents opportunities and challenges for gas use in the region and the world because we're such a major supplier to other parts of the world. Other regions are worried about it. Okay, this is the Central South America region. I'm going to go through these extremely quickly. These are in the order that we had the workshops. What you see there in the middle is a percentage of the region, the share of world population. So Central America, 6.8% of world's population, only 3.4% of its emissions, and its per capita CO2 is quite a bit lower than the global per capita tons world average as well. So that's 4.9. A few key points. The blue boxes are data or trends, et cetera, in that region. The gray boxes are direct discussion points from the region. Economic development is expected to significantly increase Central and South America's energy demand. According to IEA, this is important in many regions of the world. By 2100, Central America, Argentina, and Chile could expect, quote, a consistent decrease in mean hydropower capacity. That's because of melting glaciers and climate change. That creates a need for other sources of power generation that could be gas. There's Central and South America's high electrification rate and power sector's low share of emissions give the region a head start. But there's still a problem with harder to abate sectors. Renewables and natural gas are the only sources of generation that have increased in Latin America in recent years. And a significant share of the region's greenhouse gas emissions come from land use and deforestation. Natural gas potentially a low-hanging fruit for that, to address that issue as well. On to sub-Saharan Africa, population shifts to cities will likely increase overall energy demand. Renewable growth is expected and be the largest share of electricity, but infrastructure build out is a challenge. And today, nearly half the population does not have access to electricity. Huge energy demand increases. I forgot to say, it's only 14% of the world's population, but only 2.2% of the world's CO2 emissions. And its CO2 per capita is 0.8 tons compared to a 4.9 ton average. Trends expected to impact energy supply is the need for grids to support urbanization, for which distributed resources, both urban and rural, are considered inadequate. The fuel divestment is a concern in sub-Saharan Africa. The ESG policies of lending institutions is causing a lot of heartburn, and sub-Saharan Africa represents a significant portion of global poverty, and energy is needed to mitigate that poverty. South Asia, 24% of the world's population, only 7.9% of the emissions, and 1.6 tons per capita compared to the 4.9 overall. Many countries in the region have underdeveloped domestic energy infrastructures and will continue to rely heavily on coal for biomass, for carbon, for power generation and biomass for cooking. That contributes to greenhouse gas emissions, poor air quality, et cetera, et cetera. The amount and share of coal in the region's energy mix has grown. In 1990, it was 25%. In 2018, it was 39%. So a lot of coal there, huge problems, but relatively young infrastructure. And they don't want to, it became very clear that they don't want to retire that valuable asset. I'm going to skip through that. Many countries are making serious efforts to increase their renewable capacity. India has nearly a quarter of its energy supplied by renewables. It's the fourth largest renewable energy capacity in the world. Many actors in the region believe that natural gas is complementary to renewables. This is Southeast Asia, 8.6% of the world's population, only 4.6% of its emissions, 2.6 tons compared to 4.9 per capita. Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, this is the region where we saw the most interest in expanding natural gas consumption. And most other regions were less interested. Southeast Asia, very, very interested. Almost all the countries there. Fossil fuels overall are expected to comprise more than 80% of the energy mix by 2050. Countries in the region aim to reduce fossil fuel consumption and invest in cleaner energy like renewables. But the region believes that natural gas is complementary to renewables. We heard that a lot in several regions of the world too. Because there's significant coal generation, increased use of natural gas could reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and existing infrastructure for coal-fired power generation is viewed as important for ongoing economic development. Here's Northeast Asia. That includes China, only 3 countries in that region. It's 21% of the population, 36% of the emissions, and so an 8.2 tons per capita compared to 4.9 global average. So it's emitting a lot more, needs serious technology development and some fuel switching, which I showed you earlier, the value of fuel switching. It's heavily reliant on fossil fuels, particularly coal, but all 3 countries have set net zero targets. It lacks sufficient domestic energy resources. South Korea and Japan rely heavily on energy imports. China, South Korea, and Japan are major consumers, largest importers, LNG importers in the world. Gas dependency is high in the region, gas import dependency, and what they do in the region could have a major impact on global LNG markets because they're such large consumers. Some participants in the region expressed concerns about the uncertainty of the Biden administration's position on LNG exports. They're worried that keep it in the ground movement could affect U.S. natural gas production and its LNG supplies for those countries. And they're looking at hydrogen as an innovation to complement the use of natural gas. Here's Europe. 8.2% of the population. Here its larger share of emissions than its share of population, and its emissions are per capita are higher. The EU and UK have net zero policies, and EU is laying out a framework for achieving greenhouse gas emissions neutrality by 2050. Energy security is a key issue, particularly in Eastern Europe, and concern about reliance on Russia, but it's going to grow with the opening of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. European framework prioritizes electrification, but it has its limits. Need to develop renewable and low carbon gases like hydrogen, biomethane, biogas. Participants noted that it's unlikely that electricity alone will carry the clean energy transition in Europe. They are also looking at hydrogen. Although most methane emissions from natural gas occur in production and transport outside the EU has stated that it will use its position as the world's largest importer of fossil fuels to promote methane emissions reductions. And it has stated its intent to introduce legislation look at partners who do not reduce methane emissions. Two more regions here. MENA region, 6.3% of the world's population, higher shares of both CO2 emissions from fossil fuels and higher per capita emissions. This is not surprising. In recent decades, the region's energy demand has rapidly grown. In the near term, increased renewable generation is likely to replace oil in power generation, not natural gas. Natural gas has become a major energy source in the region, now accounts for more than half of total energy supply. And the share of natural gas in the region's gas generation in the region in 2019 was 70%. So very, very reliant on natural gas for power generation. And natural gas is currently predicted to enable and accompany renewables. Again, looking at voiced a lot of support and understanding of the synergies between natural gas and renewables. There's growing interest among regional producers in blue hydrogen and co-locating that with CCUS and storage assets. So something we are looking at EFI in the US as well. They are looking there. And this finally closing with the US, we are the laggards here in emissions reductions, 6.5% of the world's population, 16.6% of the emissions from fossil fuels, and per capita emissions are what, 70, looks like 75% higher in the North America region than the world's average. Shale revolution, everyone knows about that, has enabled us to become the largest producer of natural gas. Canada is number 4 behind US, Russia, and Iran. US is the second largest emitter of global greenhouse gases in the world. As everyone knows, I'm sure Biden administration recently rejoined the Paris Agreement, and proposed a new NDC of 50 to 50% reduction by 2030. Canada has pledged to reduce CO2 emissions 30% by 2030 and set statutory limitations for zero emissions by 2050. That's very quickly. Natural gas in Mexico is very important in power generation. Over 50% of their power generation is from natural gas. They too are worried about our natural gas policies in the US because they're very dependent on US exports of natural gas to Mexico. The participants were trepidatious about stating whether each country is on track to meet emissions reductions. While renewables deployment is anticipated to increase in the region, complementary battery and storage technology is not yet affordable or of sufficient duration. As such, natural gas is currently predicted to enable and accompany renewable generation. Again, that was a common theme in most of the regions. And North American companies are increasingly setting ESG goals and deep decarbonization goals. So with that, I have talked a lot and fast and hopefully just a little bit over time. And thank you all very much. And happy to ask any questions via email on the study moving forward. So thank you all. Thanks, Stu.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Melanie, for your description of the report. And you've basically shown that the report has really an incredible database, among other things. And you can't have strategies without good data. And so this has been really extremely helpful. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to David Goldwyn, a person who I've worked with. God, David, it must be at least 25 years at this point. He's the chairman of the Energy Advisory Group here at the Global Energy Center, a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, and a good friend. And David will introduce and moderate the first panel.
Great. Thanks very much, Dick. Appreciate it. And I also want to note my thanks to EFI. It was a real privilege for me and for my associate at Goldwyn Global Strategies, Andrea Clabo, to participate in the organization of these workshops and derivation of some of the key learnings. So a real joy to work with the EFI team. We're going to move quickly into a little bit of a deeper dive on these regional learnings. And we have a terrific panel. Asta Gupta is the Asia Edge Fellow at the National Bureau of Asian Research, which led our India workshop, or South Asia workshop. And she's also an India consultant for the International Energy Agency. Anouk Honore from the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies, who is both expert in Europe and also South America, which she's not going to talk about today, but really brilliant on that topic as well. Ken Koyama, chief economist and managing director, the Institute for Energy Economics in Japan, who led both the Southeast Asia workshops and the Northeast Asia workshops, and he's also a Middle East expert. So we've got all the regions covered on this panel. And we'll just do really lightning round questions because of the time. But the first one I have for each of you is, what's unique about the role of gas in the region you're focusing on? What role do you think it's going to play in decarbonization? And what role do you expect it to play going forward as each of your regions achieves what we hope are much higher climate ambitions? And let's go in the order of introduction. Asta, Anouk, and then Ken. Asta, the floor is yours.
Hello, David. Hello, everyone. Thank you for this great opportunity. Thanks to EFI for inviting me on this workshop, and congratulations on the report. It has really come out very well. So I'll just focus on the South Asian region for some specific examples from India also. So as most of you must be aware that the South Asian region is endowed with diverse energy resources, including coal, hydro, solar, wind, etc. And the governments are really making all the efforts to utilize this potential. But at the same time, there are ambitious policy targets by the governments to increase the natural gas in the energy mix. So for example, India has targets to double the natural gas share in the energy mix by 2030, for example. So while natural gas has played a pivotal role as the fuel for transitions in many countries with benefits of cleaner and more environmental friendly fuel substitute, examples include like switching from coal furnace oil to natural gas in power plants and industries, conversion of petrol, diesel vehicles to CNG, increasing supply of piped natural gas in the cities. So this also enables freeing up of LPG for the use in rural areas, and thus mitigating the polluted impacts of dirty biomass fuels. So while the natural gas is playing this role, at the same time, most of the countries in the region are also committing to exploit the renewable energy potential. As governments believe that renewable energy will play a central role in decarbonization, natural gas will still find place in sectors such as clean cooking, for example, in India, in the residential and commercial segments, and in light to medium scale industries. As of course, there is limited competition with other fuels in these industries, and there is, most importantly, the pace of development of cost effective technologies like hydrogen, etc., has not seen light of the day there. So while at the same time, countries such as India are also promoting and have ambitious targets on increasing production and use of biomethane as the transport fuel. We're also looking at national hydrogen mission for using the fuel in the industry sector. So while natural gas for now is seems like the most cost-effective option, but there are other gases like biomethane and hydrogen, which has also been explored in the country. Um, Also, the role of natural gas that it could play in meeting the higher ambitions of the region. I believe natural gas could provide flexibility for grid integration of renewable energy. For now, we are just looking at coal flexibility, but natural gas really has that potential. There's also scope of utilizing higher shares of natural gas in the captive power plant. Again, the captive power plants in India, are more driven by the use of coal, and of course natural gas has a potential to use as a fuel in the captive power plants, and then continuing the usage of CNG in the transport sector. So the prime minister has announced almost like 210 CNG stations in the country very recently. There's a lot of impetus on the natural gas pipelines in the southern region of the country. So I think so. The transport sector, in city gas distribution for urban areas, in flexibility for grid integration of renewables and captive power plants, is the place where natural gas still will find place in meeting its ambitions. I'll stop here.
Great, thanks, Asta. Anoop, talk to us about Europe.
Thank you, David, and thank you for the invitation today. So, gas in Europe is very likely to have an important part in the energy transition. We've already seen the case in the electricity sector, which has been the focus of the decarbonization effort so far in Europe. To give you a bit of context, we had a wave of investment in Europe in gas-fired generations in the late 1990s and in the 2000s, which means that the region was actually in an ideal place 10 years ago to be able to integrate a large amount of wind and solar rapidly, as gas plants have been able to provide a large share of the much needed flexibility into the system. The gas plant can also help to switch away from coal rapidly, as seen, for example, in the UK recently. And incidentally, the coal to gas switching in the UK in the electricity generation was one of the main reasons why the country was able to reach its 2020 emission targets. And I think over the next 10 years, gas will continue to play an important part, especially now that we've set very ambitious targets for 2030 with minus 35% emissions compared to 1990, which means that we need to reduce emissions drastically over the next 9 years, really. Of course, as Melanie just mentioned, lower energy demand and electrifications are the base of the low carbon energy strategy in Europe. But what happens with gas is not as simple, and it will vary. And by that, I mean that Europe is not a uniform region. The countries have very different starting points. They have different access to resources, and they have different economic structures, which means that the pathways to net zero will need to differ from one country to another. And that means that natural gas, can and will be part of the transition well post 2030 in some countries. On the longer term, 2050, Europe is still looking to have some gaseous fuels in its mix. Of course, by then, we mostly mean biogas, biomethane, renewable hydrogen, or syngas. But there could still be a role to play for natural gas in the mix, so fossil gas with CCUS. Exactly how much will depend on the choices made in the coming years. But for instance, just looking at some scenarios we have here in the UK made by National Grid, just to give you an example, on the 4 scenarios they have, 3 scenarios are net zero. Looking at 2 scenarios with plus or minus gas demand, one net zero scenario has about 4% in 2050 of the level of demand we had in 2019, only 4%. In another scenarios that also reaches net zero by 2050, natural gas demand represents 80% of the level we had last year or in 2019 in the UK. So it really depends what sort of choices we're going to make in terms of the mix that we want to see. And I think in the next few months and years will give us more clarity on the pathways toward net zero in Europe. But what is already certain is that there will not be one single solution to the decarbonization challenge, and therefore not one simple answer for the future role of gas in Europe. And I'm going to stop here.
Great, thanks, Anouk. And that was a key takeaway from the study. Ken, apologies Apologies for asking to cover such a large region in such a short amount of time, but you're a master of concision, so I know you'll do well. Thanks very much.
David, thank you very much again for your kind introduction. And also I'd like to thank EFI and Atlantic Council, all the friends joining today. In short, I think that the natural gas or LNG in both Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia, I do believe that the gas, LNG, is playing a key role and continue to play a key role for energy transition. And again, I'd like to agree with my fellow panelists that much depends on how serious and how successful that countries are trying to reach the carbon neutrality. It will affect the future appetite and the future market structure of LNG and natural gas. For Northeast Asia, the uniqueness lies in that we are the large-scale LNG importer of the world. China, Japan, Korea together account for almost half of the global LNG market. And we are using LNG as a key clean energy sources in our energy mix. And I do believe in the short space of time and the medium term that LNG in both Korea and Japan, continue to play a big role. And also in China, I do believe that the natural gas consumption and LNG consumption is very likely to expand for longer term. So what's going to happen in the LNG market in this key region, Northeast Asia, is a very important determinant for the global natural gas and LNG market. And importantly, that these three countries that commonly announce that the long-term ambitious carbon neutrality target, Korea, Japan for the 2050 and China for 2060. Again, I do believe it's a very ambitious target. How we can successfully achieve the carbon neutrality at the target year is still a big open question. So under the circumstance, in my view, is that at least 2030 and 2040, I think that the natural gas and LNG is going to play a key role in at least the Korea and Japan, and for China for more longer term. And again, 2050 and beyond, I think that much depend on the seriousness of these countries to address the carbon neutrality. So under the circumstance, if they are really seriously address these issues, some of the new innovative approach, including the carbon neutral LNG or other innovative energy source like hydrogen and CO2-free ammonia, is going to affect the natural gas market. For Southeast Asia, I think that the uniqueness lies in that it's the characteristics of the growing energy demand, or in other words, the growth center for the global energy market and natural gas and LNG market. The electricity demand, industry demand in this region is likely to increase. So I do believe that even if the countries in this region is trying to go for the more cleaner energy system, I think there's a big potential to see that the growth continue to the long run, at least up to 2040, 2050. For the LNG and natural gas demand is likely to continue. But one important key element for this region is the competitiveness of natural gas or LNG supply cost. Was affordability is a very important issue. And also in common to all this region, I think that the infrastructure needs and infrastructure investment to accommodate the growth of the LNG natural gas is a key element. I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Ken. Let me pick up on that point of the intersection of LNG and U.S. LNG and regional climate, economic, and geopolitical goals. And you've kind of inferred it's important for Asia. Let me ask the other panelists, how important is the U.S. LNG export capacity or the U.S. Participation in the global market to the achievement of regional decarbonization, geopolitical, or economic goals? Asta, let's start with you.
Thank you for this question. So I believe that countries, especially in the region of South Asia, like Bangladesh and India, they are, of course, there is limited domestic resource available. Of course, India is pushing towards developing natural gas pipelines. There's domestic resource development happening, and Bangladesh, there is of course depleting natural gas resources, which is happening. So, the countries in the region are pursuing import of LNG, definitely. Also, LNG is now being also recognized for a transport fuel potentially to use in the heavy duty vehicles and buses, in addition to the industries and power plants. So I definitely feel that US LNG holds great importance to help meet the LNG requirements of the region. Again, because of strategic partnership relationships between India and US, for example. So it will definitely play an important role.
Thanks very much. Anouk?
Okay, so well, as you know, in Europe, the indigenous production of natural gas is declining pretty much everywhere except Norway, which means that imports are going to rise, even in a situation of declining demand for natural gas. And Europe is in a good position because it has many terminals, and LNG brings extra volumes, but also increases diversifications of routes and sources for these imports. And this may become more and more important in the coming months and years, as keeping gas prices competitive and keeping a perception of security of supply will be important if gas is to continue to play a role in the energy mix. It will be even more important if the LNG community takes steps to reduce its methane emissions rapidly. So what I'm saying here, the key message is that any negative signals about gas imports, volumes, prices, security, will most likely ensure a much faster transition away from gas toward other options in the transition process in Europe. So here is the potential role here for US LNG, is to secure that position.
Great, thanks. And Ken, I think we caught most of your points. Anything you wanted to add on sort of the importance of the U.S. Export capacity for Asia's
In
decarbonization?
short, I think that the US LNG is a game changer to many Asian players. Before the US LNG became available, that the Asian traditional LNG market is dominated by the long-term contract and also the JCC crude oil indexation. But now that we are seeing that US LNG becoming a kind of source of diversity, source of flexibility, source of competitiveness. So I do hope that the US LNG continue to play this key, critically important role to change the structural change to Asian LNG market, which will be good for the security of supply as well as contribution to the cleaner energy system in Asia.
Great, thanks very much. I've got one more question for each of you, and to keep us on time, I know our panel's supposed to end at 9:55. We're going to take just steal 1 minute from Rob and ask each of you for sort of a lightning round on this. But put your policymaker hat on. For the region that you are in, what is the biggest obstacle to achieving policy outcomes consistent with a 1.5 degree scenario? And if you were able to wave your magic wand, what are the main things that need to change about policy frameworks, or the main policy changes you think need to happen in order to achieve those goals? And I'm sorry to only give you 1 minute for those, but often that's what you get with a policymaker. So again, Asta, let's start with you.
Are you able to hear me?
Yes, we are.
Okay, yeah. So very quickly, of course, South Asian region is giving very less impetus to the net zero emission targets. Of course, focus more on energy access and security. So that's the key thing. And looking at that aspect, and when the population is progressing towards urbanization, industrialization, and over economic development, what I think the key challenges to meet the emission reductions is that for this lack of policy and regulatory clarity on the innovative clean energy technologies in the region. One that's very important. The renewable energy grid integration with limited flexibility. There's low pace of infrastructure growth, lack of investments, and in general the impacts of pandemic on the energy transition. So these are the key challenges, and I believe the three key policy changes that could enable or overcome these challenges is we recognize these fuels and make them more affordable in light of bringing co-benefits of these fuels that they can offer to both urban and rural areas. Two, bringing more flexibility of, again, renewable energy grid integration through developing appropriate regulatory frameworks for flexibility from both coal, natural gas, and other storage technologies. And third and most important is continuing with market reforms. including more regional cooperation on energy markets and trade. I hope, and I'll stop here. Thanks.
Thanks. Anouk?
Okay, so challenges. Well, the Green Deal and achieving net zero emissions by 2050 will be the most challenging transformation of the economies of the modern era, really. And the targets are very ambitious. And maybe even more challenging is the timing to reach those targets. And for me, the two main challenges will be A, making sure the investment happen in good time. That will be crucial. And despite the large amount of money being directed at energy transition, it may still not be enough. Actually, it is not enough. Also, we do know that this process will be difficult, disruptive, and costly for everyone. But for some countries, it will be tremendously challenging to meet the targets in time. And I wonder if this may not be underestimated sometimes, or we are just really starting to understand what it means in practical terms to achieve net zero in 30 years, or 29 years actually now. We've heard concerns about some Eastern European countries during our workshop, and this is a very important point, I think, that needs more attention. I'm not singling out Eastern Europe. We've heard different views as well from some Western European countries. My point here is that going with a too rigid approach of how we get there could potentially create tensions, and at the end of the day, potentially create real problems for the whole process, and that really needs to be looked at very carefully.
Thanks very much. Ken, the last word for our panel?
Okay, I have 2 points. Firstly, I think that energy transition to that net zero emission requires a kind of revolutionary change from the current global energy system, which is heavily dependent on fossil fuel utilization. And also, as everybody understands, that energy supply chain is characterized by the legacy asset. So I think this is really challenging and ambitious target. But if we really want to see this happen, that I think probably the key word is innovation. Without the contribution of innovation, what kind of innovation, whatever kind of innovation, hydrogen, CCUS, or direct air capture, BECCS, whatever, I think that without this, we cannot expect reaching the net zero emission. So I think that this is an unprecedented and a big challenge. And probably the second point related to this, the transition to this new extremely ambitious challenge requires a huge money, huge investment, and probably huge extra cost. But probably, particularly from the viewpoint of Asia or developing world, I think that minimizing the transition cost should be the key word. I think that without minimizing the cost, I think that it's quite difficult to cause many difficult and complicated problems, including that very serious north-south problems. I'll stop here.
Terrific. Let me thank each of my panelists for tremendous and extremely concise insights. You've set the bar very high for the second panel. And now I want to turn the microphone over to Rob Stoner, who's our moderator for the Financing the Future panel. I think you all know Rob. He's the Deputy Director for Science and Technology at the MIT Energy Initiative, and really one of the world's leading scholars on energy in the developing world. So Rob, we've set the bar high. Over to you.
You did, but thanks for moving quickly, David. And thanks to your panelists for building us a very helpful foundation. This panel is about financing the future transition, which means moving toward a low carbon energy system aggressively where gas may or may not be a feature. I think it's clear that gas will be important in most highly developed economies for some time, certainly in the US and much of Europe, and with the increasingly widespread availability of LNG in developing economies elsewhere as well, or rather developed economies elsewhere as well. Financing gas projects in those capital saturated markets has its challenges, to be sure, many of them political or geopolitical, or connected with climate change concerns and policy, and the possible creation of stranded assets. But at least there is plenty of capital. The future is less clear in emerging markets and developing economies. Many of those currently rely on cheap non-gas options like coal and diesel, sometimes hydro, and increasingly, at least in some countries, solar and wind. In many of these countries, gas has the potential to help lower greenhouse emissions as a substitute fuel to provide flexibility for expanded solar and wind and enable further industrialization. However, energy infrastructure is expensive, and the report reminds us that in addition to all of the challenges advanced economies face, Many developing and emerging economies have thin capital markets and are heavily indebted, problems that have been greatly magnified by the pandemic. And they must rely on substantially foreign blended private and DFI capital, which in turn exposes currency problems and concerns about instability, sustainability of markets, and a host of other issues. With us to talk about financing the transition regionally are four speakers with experience from around the world. I'll introduce them briefly and then go back to them for brief remarks from their experience globally as well as from the regions that we've identified them in. Alain Eboubize is the Chief Executive Officer of Africa 50, a Pan-African infrastructure investment platform. I have the pleasure of serving with Alain and Ernie on the Rockefeller Foundation funded Global Commission to End Energy Poverty, which focuses mainly on electrification. Lisa Viciti is the Director of Energy, Climate Change, and Extractive Industries at the Inter-American Dialogue. She's a specialist on Latin American issues. Ruslan Stefanov is the Program Director and Chief Economist of the Center for Study of Democracy, a European governance and anti-corruption think tank based in Bulgaria. His current work focuses on the energy transition and governance in Europe. And finally, Leila Benali is a highly accomplished international expert in energy and infrastructure, as well as strategic planning and investment and energy diplomacy. She recently joined the International Energy Forum as chief economist and was previously chief economist and head of strategy and sustainability at the Arab Petroleum Investments Corporation. And a warm welcome to all of you. As I said, we'll keep it simple, and I'll just go to each of you in turn and ask you to speak from your regional experience and broader international experience. I will reserve the right to interrupt anyone who says anything interesting that I think needs more further comment, and I'll definitely interrupt you if you go over time. We're going to somehow end up at about 10:25. So Alain, let's start with you. You clearly have substantial global experience, but tell us about the African transition in particular, if you would.
Yeah, thank you, Rob. And indeed, I'll focus on Africa and I can answer questions on other parts of the world. Africa, because of course, this is the region where Africa 50 is operating. You know, I think the key goal for African countries really should be, is to have a balanced energy mix, which on the one hand will help achieve the continent's huge development needs, while at the same time helping countries transition towards net zero economies. And that's the approach that we are taking at Africa 50. We have 28 African countries as our shareholders, two African central banks, and then the African Development Bank, and with a mandate to help bridge the continent's huge infrastructure gap. Of course, we focus on energy, but not only on energy, we focus also on other sectors. Now, we use our project development expertise and our financing expertise to support the climate transition of African countries. But I must say that date also in our own portfolio of investment, most of our investments are in the renewable space, but not only that. Let me emphasize one thing, which is quite important. A big majority of African countries have ratified their commitment to the Paris Agreement. So there's a strong commitment across the continent to transition towards net zero, indeed with significant renewable energy. This transition should, however, take into account the principles of equity and differentiation, which some of the panelists mentioned earlier, but I believe that is also acknowledged in the Paris Agreement. So we have to look at regional and capabilities and regional context. I should highlight that renewables today already account for more than half of new energy generation generation capacity here in Africa. And this will continue to grow. And the continent has a number of big renewables projects. Many of you may know about the 1.5 gigawatt Bemban solar park in Egypt, which Africa 50 has invested in, and it's one of the largest solar plants currently in operation in the world. Now, while Africa will continue to adopt those climate-friendly policies, the continent also has huge and urgent, I would argue, development needs. And because, for example, the continent's population is expected to grow to 2.4 billion people by 2050. And the report mentioned a figure that all of us should know, that the urban population of this continent in Africa will grow from $400 million in 2010 to 1.2 billion in 2050. So we need to create a lot of jobs, business opportunities, industrial growth, innovation, digital, you name it. This means that we need to scale up and more importantly, speed up energy projects while also building a resilient climate infrastructure. So we believe that in order to do so, natural gas can serve as both a critical bridge fuel to support intermittent renewables with base load power, and also, and it's quite important actually when you look at the African context, as feedstock or fuel for industries, buildings and transportation. But we have to think about these industries because industrialization is a central part of Africa development goal. So natural gas, of course, has been mentioned, can facilitate integration with wind and solar into power systems, providing some level of flexibility. So there are a lot of good benefits. But I also want to say that natural gas can reduce the use of wood and charcoal as cooking fuel. So this is quite important because it also improves health and lowering carbon emission. So clearly, gas will be part of Africa's renewable transition. And the alternative is actually worse because if we don't use gas, honestly, and yet we have to support those development goals, you will have, for example, more less clean fuels like HFO or coal that will be used. So I think that is quite important. Now, I think one of the biggest challenges is how do we actually finance that transition, the financing piece, which is a big challenge because in fact the amounts of money that we are talking about are huge. And I think many panelists actually mentioned that, whether it's Anouk and also Ken, I think you all mentioned that financing is quite important. And in Africa, we have a huge challenge in attracting financing to finance the transition. And honestly, if we don't find enough money to finance the transition, it's going to be difficult. Now, at Africa 50, what we are trying to do is to help increase the volume of private investment so that we don't only rely on official government funding. So we're trying to structure projects so that they're bankable in order to attract those private investment. So we want to finance gas infrastructure to enable the gas to be used. We also want to make sure that we can bring this gas, which is especially gas which is produced in Africa, and increase the use of domestic gas on the continent for various purposes. So that's what I like to say. And to finish off, Rob, I like to say that, of course, we would do all of this, invest in natural gas infrastructure by meeting certain principles, which will ensure that we give priority to projects that promote best practices in terms of resource management, but also ESG standards, because indeed, this is quite important. And I think that a number of financing institutions, they are a bit shy today in looking at fossil fuel projects, even gas. But we are making the case that gas is an important transition fuel to enable our countries in Africa to meet their development needs while also defining a pathway to achieve net zero emission. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Okay, let's cross the South Atlantic now to Lisa Vicidi and the story in Latin America, which is very different.
Yes, thank you very much, Rob. So in Latin America, the share of natural gas in the energy mix is expected to grow, largely because the share of hydropower is declining and gas is used as a firm energy source to complement rising generation from wind and solar. So as a region, Latin America has actually the cleanest power sector in the world because around half of installed capacity is hydro. But the total figure is kind of distorted by a few very large markets with 70 or 80% installed capacity of hydro, like Brazil and Colombia. And then really other countries like Mexico and particularly Caribbean nations have much less hydro, and gas actually offers the possibility to replace higher emissions and more expensive oil for power generation. But in any case, little new hydropower is expected to be built. And that's mainly because local populations are opposed because of the high environmental and social impacts and costs. And it's also because of concerns about reliability as climate change is changing hydraulic patterns, especially in South America. So natural gas is expected to meet a lot of the new marginal increases in demand. So even though Latin America overall has an electrification rate that's very high, it's over 90% average, electricity demand is still continuing to grow along with economic growth. So a lot of countries are looking to expand natural gas markets and infrastructure for power generation, for industrial use, for transport, and for heating. And countries like Brazil and Argentina have large domestic resources of gas as well. So they're also actually looking to expand the domestic market in order to monetize this gas and make use of it, and even in some cases to export to other countries. And in my opinion, from what I've seen, these countries don't seem that concerned about natural gas infrastructure becoming stranded assets. I would say rather the main challenge to expanding gas infrastructure, as well as other needed infrastructure like renewables, transmission lines, all this is needed. And I think the main barrier is more the political and regulatory uncertainty in these countries. So often, countries introduce incentives, but then when a new government comes in, those incentives are taken away or changed. And generally, I think that governments are not sending clear enough signals to the market that there is policy and regulatory support for investing in energy infrastructure over the long term. And so this ties into the challenge of financing. Multilateral development banks, national credit agencies like the Development Finance Corporation of the United States, Chinese development and commercial banks, they're all investing in renewable energy and transmission infrastructure in particular. They are investing less and less in hydropower because, as I said, it's seen to have too many problems for the local environment and populations. And they're also less and less investing in natural gas because it's not seen as environmentally or carbon friendly. So in recent years, China's investments have overall for Latin America have shifted more to advanced technologies like 5G and telecommunications. But Chinese companies have always been large players in the energy sector, in natural resources in Latin America, especially South America. And that's still the case. There's still certain markets where there's a lot of Chinese investment, like the oil sector in Ecuador, the mining sector in Peru, the power sector in Brazil and Peru. So this financing, as the multilaterals, the Chinese, the US, for renewables and transmission lines, it helps, but it's not enough. And most of the funds really to meet the volumes that are required need to come from the private sector. And right now, with the pandemic having hit Latin America as one of the worst regions in the world hit by the pandemic, government coffers are weak. And so governments can't afford to introduce big tax incentives for private investment, but they need the private capital. So for countries with poor credit ratings like Argentina and several Caribbean countries, for example, it's really difficult to attain financing from international capital markets for any type of energy infrastructure. So I think that the lack of regulatory clarity gives pause to investors. And so I see this as really the biggest challenge around financing both gas and renewable infrastructure is sort of how do you create an investment environment that's really friendly and that really brings in the big volumes of capital that are going to come from the private sector.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Lisa. Let's turn now back to Europe and Central Europe, where Ruslan Stefanov is sitting in Sofia with a very different outlook. Ruslan.
Thanks, Rob, and thanks to Secretary Muniz and Melanie for having us shape this discussion. I think it's been great, and a lot has been said about Europe already, including the very ambitious targets that Europe has had for 2030 and 2050. And of course, how to fund this is essential. And let me just mention 5 factors that I think turn Central and Eastern Europe into a very interesting region, because I think this region is going to exemplify the tensions within the European approach. Let me first start by focusing on the capital scarcity in the region. Comparatively speaking, of course, when we compare to other regions, but in Europe, Central and Eastern Europe is not known for its deep capital markets, so it will rely primarily on bank finance private sector, and foremost on the European Union, so public financing. That means a lot of these countries are going to face expanding public sector funding through EU funds, coming to the tune of 3 to 5% of GDP annually in the next 5 to 10 years. And that's a lot of money channeled through the government. And here comes the next challenge, and that means what we just heard on the on Latin America, is the governance capacity and the governance function of Central and Eastern Europe. And if you've seen the Global Magnitsky Act designations on Europe, European countries, EU countries, or if you've seen the rule of law report of the EU, will see that these countries, these economies are not known for the high quality of their investment. And in some cases, you have regions in Central and Eastern Europe that are 10 times poorer in GDP per capita compared to the EU average in absolute terms. And that's a huge difference when one comes to think about financing transition. And that means these countries are going to be very, very sensitive in their governments about the cost of that transition. I think this was mentioned a couple of times. And if you've watched the, although overshadowed by the G7 meeting, if you've watched the last meeting of Europe's energy ministers over the weekend, so on Friday, exactly these countries, Romania and Poland leading, are pressing to keep investment in gas infrastructure alive and part of the energy transition in Europe. These countries rely a lot on Soviet time reliance on nuclear. A lot of countries, Czechia, Slovakia, Bulgaria, Romania, including Russian technology and gas. And if you look at the investment, the largest investments in the last decade, these have been actually in gas infrastructure, in pipelines. And of course, let me finish by pointing out to another critical constraint that we've been dealing with in the past, I should say, a decade, and that is the elephant in the room, and that's Russia. These countries are squeezed between their apparent desire to keep, to use gas as a transition fuel, maybe retrofit their gas infrastructure into hydrogen, develop offshore wind, all very, very costly solutions. So I think governments in Central and Eastern Europe are going to be desperate about keeping gas infrastructure. And here I think Europe needs to do a little bit more of its homework on two fronts. One is introducing better interconnectivity within these markets. I think this was not finished business under the European Energy Union. And second, dealing with Russia. Russia is not going to go away, and the key thing about Russia's projects, as CSD has described in its Kremlin playbook reports, is that they're not just about entirely not about gas, but they're about funding networks of oligarchic energy and political networks in the region, both in Russia and in Europe. And these networks are going to keep pushing Europe away from that path. And we've seen that with shale gas. 10 years ago, Gazprom was very successful in blocking shale gas development all across Central and Eastern Europe with massive advertising campaign and massive payments to these same local networks. So we need to find a way to ensure that the energy transition, ambitious energy transition of Europe, doesn't end up in essentially playing or realizing what Mr. Putin's plans were 10 years ago, and that's having the Nord Stream and South Stream lines realized. And energy security of Central Eastern Europe through energy transition is going to be critical. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ruslan. Leila, you've been patiently sitting there for the last hour listening to all of this, and no doubt reflecting on your regional context of the Middle East, but you're also an internationalist. And I wonder if you could just bring the whole thing together in the next 6 minutes and reflect on your broader global perspective as well.
Thanks, Rob. Yeah, no, thanks to the Atlantic Council and the EFI to gather this webinar and the report. I think it's very timely. And I would like to, try to squeeze in 6 minutes some thoughts about, well, the Middle East and North Africa, because this is where a lot of the investments are happening. and provide an international perspective of where we see the investments in the gas value chain going forward. I'd like to start with maybe a lesson that we learned from the pandemic that is definitely, I think, relevant for our discussion today. I think we discovered a gas industry that is much more interdependent than we thought, with a lot of restrictions to supply chains in 2020. If you remember, Lombardy in Italy, which is a major region for engineering services for the LNG industry, has been one of the first hits by COVID-19. The Asian shipyards were also among the first hits. So I think with the fact that these were all heavily affected by the first waves of COVID-19 increased the pressure on several parts of the value chain to really decentralize and localize as much as possible, while the industry is craving cost efficiency and is competing for capital, as it has already been mentioned. A couple of points on prices. Is gas really inexpensive? I mean, in June 2021, I'm a bit reluctant to portray gas as an inexpensive fuel when prices witnessed the huge volatility that we saw this winter and are increased in expectation of heat waves. I mean, I'm sitting in the Middle East here. I can tell you that it's very hot. It's actually really hot this year compared to previous years. But in many consumer markets, including the US, I think futures, even in Henry Hub, have closed last week for 5% to $3.3 per MMBTU. And that has been the highest settlement since October. We've seen also a sharp rebound, if you remember, due to cold winter in Asia, a drop in nuclear and coal in Japan and Korea, unplanned outages of LNG terminals. So I think in early 2021, you remember, we had some spot LNG cargoes trading at more than $40 per MMBTU. But the gains have also been driven by the inflationary pressures that we've seen in all commodities across the sector. So I think for investors, they see this some serious volatility going forward. And I agree, like argued in the report, that the uncertainty poses problems for investment decisions in all stages of the value chain. But what do we do? What do we have in terms of today, in terms of investments? I mean, in 2020, it was reminded that the LNG industry produced one FID, only one final investment decision, 3.2 million tons per annum in Costa Azul plant in Mexico, while you had 97 million tons per annum, or 200 BCM of liquefaction projects, which were totally frozen in 2020. So that has created sort of uncertainty on a future flow of liquefaction projects, at least. So while the industry was really concerned more than a year ago about oversupply, there are now concerns about market tightness. And you have, on top of that, some project-specific concerns, like the $20 billion LNG project that Total has suspended for now in Mozambique because of a surge of violence. So I think we cannot really run away from cycles. Investors have to believe in that. I think what is true today for gas is probably true for gas probably more than oil, because you see today the potential waves of consolidations around low-cost assets, and the balance of investments is now shifting towards the best capitalized state-owned companies, some of the integrated large IOCs, and a few selected gas specialists. So number one, I think access to capital, it was mentioned, is definitely one key characteristics of the companies who will still be around in a decade from now. And number two, integration with midstream, downstream, and marketing capabilities is definitely important. And bearing in mind that gas will be competing for investment dollars, as Melanie highlighted so eloquently earlier in her remarks, in countries with firm, competing with investment dollars with renewables, in countries with firm renewable targets. But I don't think it's the only point of competition that gas will have to be dealing with in the next few years. Let me take a couple of examples on this story around well-capitalized companies and access to capital. In 2020, I think we reached a very few players reached 2020 with a nice capitalized situation. You have decreasing free cash flows across the board. You have very few players with improved financial performance on net income, on EBITDA, on return on average capital employed. I will not use the examples of Saudi Aramco and a couple of Russian players, but these are players who were able to tap the debt market at interesting pricing in 2020, and we see a couple of those also as well in 2021. The MENA region, the Middle East and North Africa, is the only region in the world last year where the gas value chain registered an increase actually in planned investments of more than 10% or 15% in 2020. This year, in 2021, the increase is happening in chemicals investment of around 19% in planned investments in chemicals. You have one crude to chemical scheme, but the majority is really gas-based and gas-fed chemical plants. And Qatar's decision to move ahead with the world's largest LNG expansion, I think, including carbon capture in its investments, in its development plans, is, I think, a strong statement of the fact that it really wants to maintain its leadership position in LNG. We learned recently that 6 IOCs have submitted bids a couple of weeks ago to join this scheme, the $30 billion North Field development. So you have really the traditional needs to cover domestic demand, but really strategic drivers to increase low-cost capacity and to capture more capture share in what we thought would be an oversupplied market. But there are a couple of interesting things that I would want to portray here when we look at this deal very specifically. When you look at the returns that were offered, 8 to 10%, that's what we think the returns that were offered. This is much lower, much more lower than the 15, 20% offered during the first wave, the first Qatari LNG projects. But the oil and gas industry as a whole is really realizing that this year, I mean, the pandemic, that the crisis that we were hit with is probably much more challenges than previous downturns. And you see a profound restructuring along the value chain in oil and gas, but particularly in gas. If you look at the E&P capex, and I'll finish with those the last 2 minutes that I have left, the industry has moved from being at the beginning of the decade, 1 minute, okay, at the beginning of the decade, being an $8 billion or $1 trillion capex 10 years ago to less than $300 billion this year. You have cost curves are steepening, and capex commitment to those long cycle large projects are really falling. I can share with you some numbers, but the good news for shareholders is that with these capital disciplines, the hurdle rates are improving. So you have a squeezed, concentrated industry, but probably more profitable on the oil side than the gas side. And Qatar, Russia, and the US are definitely set to pick up the construction project activity. So my point here is that gas will not only be competing with investment dollar or for investment dollars with the renewables, but also with the good old profitable low cost oil projects. I also had a couple of thoughts about on the infrastructure per se. On the regasification capacity, you still have 200 BCM of regasification capacity under construction. In the US, you have a rebound of activity with the additional Permian associated gas volumes. In Europe, indeed, gas infrastructure and hydrogen network planning is becoming increasingly integrated, and especially with hydrogen, and you have 2/3 of the 40,000 kilometers of hydrogen pipeline infrastructure being repurposed pipelines from gas. So, and that was the second characteristic of the winning strategy that I mentioned earlier, integration and marketing capabilities.
Okay.
I'll finish on that.
We're at time, and I have to hand it back to the secretary to wrap things up. But I'd like
Thank
to
you very much.
and the rest of our panel for being patient with our extremely constrained masterclass in energy finance around the world. And I look forward to hearing from you again. Ernie, back to you.
Well, thanks, Rob, and thanks to you all and to David Goldwyn for chairing these panels. Certainly fascinating panels, and it shows compressing 20 plus hours of workshops into 1 hour of discussion is tantalizing, but somewhat inadequate. Also, let me, by the way, add thanks to Dave Goldwyn for being such a stalwart in working with us to organize these workshops. I'm not going to certainly summarize these summaries, but a few points I think I'd just like to reemphasize. One is, as we heard earlier, differentiation and equity are really going to be extremely important issues. In fact, one differentiation aspect that became clear is even our differentiation of the world into these regional workshops is an inadequate differentiation, since there's lots of variation even within these areas. But I think we did not explicitly parse things out. We could have, and I think this may be interesting going forward, in the different regions' characteristics in terms of supply and demand. So, for example, obviously North America, the United States, is an unusual situation of enormous supply and enormous demand, with huge implications for what was just discussed, pricing. 330 may sound high to 250, but it's still quite a low gas price in terms of the global picture, especially for a commodity where transportation of the commodity is such an enormous piece of the action. And if you think of the implications of that, we've heard hydrogen mentioned several times. Many of us thinking about kind of hydrogen as potentially almost a successor to natural gas in terms of supplying multiple sectors with lower carbon fuel, roughly speaking. But then sometimes we don't think about what the relative pricing is, because frankly, even the dream, I would say, of hydrogen cost reduction still takes you to $8 or $10 per million BTU. And that comparison to the gas prices looks very different in the United States, let's say, to some of those countries dependent upon LNG. So I think we really need to think through kind of this matrix of implications of gas prices. I'd also just mention innovation was mentioned. There's just so much to talk about. I'll just finish with this, that innovation was mentioned, and a real, I think, couple of major questions here for the gas future, particularly in certain regions. Will CCS really become a material enterprise? Whether it's for blue hydrogen or capture from industrial facilities, cement plants and steel plants, et cetera. I think that's a major question for our underlying issues here. And secondly, going beyond carbon capture from power plants and industrial facilities, what about negative carbon technologies? If these become real, I think it could be almost a game changer for how natural gas is viewed going forward. So there are just so many questions left to answer, so many questions stimulated by the panelists, who I really want to thank for their insights. This is all going to be very, very helpful as we hope to move forward to a second phase of being able to do more analysis and to develop many more recommendations for how gas develops in a low carbon world, both on the road to Glasgow and of course well beyond Glasgow. So thanks to all again, and I'm going to turn back to our host, Dick Morningstar, for his last words.
Well, thank you, Mr. Secretary, and thank you for your final comments. I couldn't agree more with you on the importance of technology innovation and seeing as to what in fact is feasible with respect to various aspects of technology innovation, which also emphasizes, at least in my view, the importance of the private sector. And that as we move forward, and if gas is going to continue to be important, policymakers, governments, have to work together with the private sector to do everything we can to decarbonize gas and to make it acceptable, even more acceptable from an environmental standpoint. I would like to thank everybody involved with respect to today's program, cooperating and co-hosting with the Energy Futures Initiative has been a great honor for the Atlantic Council. It really is a tremendous report and provides such an incredible base for further discussion. I also want to thank everybody at the Atlantic Council who helped make this program possible, and including David Goldwyn and all of the people on our staff that have made this possible, including David Yellen and our event staff. And of course, thanks to the secretary and Melanie and all of the panelists. So I think it's time to close it out. We could talk forever, but time is up. And I hope that you will continue to attend and participate in Atlantic Council events. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.